I took the liberty to change my talk up a little bit, right? So instead of experimenting with experiments, that sounds so academic. Let's fold a great paper airplane together. And I want to teach you because this is really cool. Okay, competition in games makes things a little bit more fun, right? So I could have just had you guys fold the airplanes and said, just trust me, this is going to be a great airplane. Or I could have just said, like, just throw it, just chuck it from your seats. And for you, you might say, okay, well, that was fun to fold it and to fling it, but that seemed like a waste of time. But adding a competition aspect just made it more, something where people might try harder. They might say, hey, I want to make sure I win. I want to make sure that I make the folds correctly so I can beat the person sitting next to me and boast over them or something. Now, students think the same way, right? We all react the same way. When there's competition, we say, wouldn't it be nice if we win? And so can't we approach any experiments or games that way with some kind of competition aspect to them? So, just to help you to see that, you are this way as well. Second, involving everyone is better than just involving a subset. So if I were to just say, can I have 2 volunteers come up to demonstrate how to fold this paper airplane, that would be great because students can see what's going on, but at the same time, you might lose focus. You might start checking your phone. You might start saying, hey, I just got an email, and what just happened, right? But if you were actively participating, there's a higher chance that you're going to actually go through the entire thing, go through the entire process, and isn't that what we want in our lectures, in our classes, that students are all hopefully following along? Next, learning by doing. We all know this, right? It's better to do and learn than to just read and learn. And so that's hopefully one thing that you saw from the experiment, that by doing, you learn how to fold the paper airplane. However, some of you couldn't, right? The first time was hard. So that's why repetition is also helpful. If I were to do this same thing again, if I had 2 hours to talk, I would just probably have you fold the planes 10 times. And by the 10th time, you would know exactly how to make the plane following along with the PowerPoint. So I want to make the case, too, that when we do these experiments, it's helpful to repeat so that students are actually learning from them and not just trying to figure out how things work. Okay? So if I were to run it again, some of you who didn't make the folds correctly the first time now know, oh, I messed up in that part. I'm going to make sure I don't make that same mistake again. And so you learn from that as well. And that's part of learning by doing also. So there's obvious differences between folding paper airplanes and teaching economic concepts. That's for sure. You can't really fold supply and demand. You can't fold comparative advantage. You can't fold Nash equilibrium. So we can't really just take this and say, students are going to now fold these concepts, and therefore they can now really know them. However, I think that we can certainly make these concepts hands-on for them. And I think a great way to do this, and for me so far the best way of doing this, has been to use experiments and games in class. So add some competition, add some kind of aspect where they can actually beat their classmates, and they will actually try harder than you thought they could, right? Because if they're just sitting there staring at you, all of a sudden you say, we're going to have a competition with maybe a little prize, right? And now they're going to say, ooh, what is that competition and how can I win? Now, because this is a technology conference, these experiments and games have been run in classrooms for a long time, right? So I'm speaking to you as a novice in this, and I know a lot of you have such great backgrounds in running experiments, running games, that you're like, I already do this, okay? And that's awesome. Keep up what you're doing, and I want to learn from you. One thing that I do want to say is just to tell you a little bit about how technological advances have helped in doing this in the classroom. So for me, at the University of Minnesota, I teach a large lecture in the spring of 450 students usually. And so I can't really just run experiments where everyone's out of their seats and walking around and doing things where it would just take the entire class. So there has to be a way to add these to the classroom. So I want to talk, before I talk about some solutions that I've had, I want to talk about the pushback that I've had before in doing these experiments. Because personally, I was not always of the persuasion that we should have students do these classroom activities and games and experiments. And so I'm going to use the two words interchangeably, experiments and games, even though that's not, for an experimental economist, you're probably saying they're not the same. But let's just assume they are. We assume things all the time in economics, so why not do it here? So some pushbacks that I've had was that first, it takes a really long time to plan, right? I'm going to spend hours trying to plan this experiment. I'm going to, it's going to be super complicated, and I'm going to need to have teaching materials for all of this. But my thought on this now is that it doesn't have to be this super complex game that has 20 stages and people can level up and they lose health points or something every time they do something incorrectly. It can just be a very simple game where they do something to compete with someone else, right? So I'm keeping that super vague because just like a few of our talks yesterday, I think the best way to teach economics is really to be yourself, right? And so see the economics around your life. And so if you think of a game that's fun to you, it's going to be fun to the students. Second is that it takes the whole class to run. Now, I'm not saying that you should change your lectures or change what you're doing by using games instead. I'm just saying use them as motivators. That's what I do. So I usually run these 5 to 15 minutes experiments in games to motivate a certain topic. And I usually find that that's a time that's well invested because I can always in the lecture go back to the experiment and game that we just played and say, don't you remember when you were a buyer for these oranges and you set your price too high? Who did that? And people would say, oh yeah, I did that. I set the price too high. Third is that it takes a lot of effort to generate results, and that's a good thing about technology nowadays, right? It's not that now we can just have an entire class of experiments because we have to spend half of it running it and then like another half trying to generate the results, having everyone come up with their piece of paper and saying, okay, what's your transactions? Because now technology makes that a lot easier. So MobLab and VEcon Labs are two that I've heard are great, and I've used MobLab in my own classroom. And it just makes generating results easy and instantaneous, right? So when you run it, you can just say, I'm not going to worry about trying to get all these results. I'm just going to show you the results because it's already generated for me. And it also makes repetition a breeze, right? So if you want to repeat a game, just like if I wanted to repeat the paper airplane activity, I mean, there's a sunk cost, of the time that it's going to take you to do it. But I think, with economic concepts, we can make the argument that, it's good to just run the game a few rounds so that students will actually learn the economics behind it and not worry about, the mechanics, okay? And so I think technology also does that really well. MobLab is actually here outside this weekend, and so you can ask them more about what they do. And lastly, that it takes a PhD in experimental economics to do well. I really hope not, because for one, I don't have one, and so if that's the case, then I'm not doing it well. But I really do think that it's a matter of specialization as well. So you have these great experimental economists who already have written these games, right? A lot of times you will find these resources out there where these games are already there, people have researched it, and for you, it's just looking into these games and saying, hey, I want to run it in my classroom, even though there's a cost to run it the first time, even though there's this, maybe students would get confused and there would be a huge, horrible, chaotic classroom or something. But I think that's the fear of trying something new in anything, right? And so I would, for me, I just try to add a few games to my classes every semester. I don't try to overload them with games, but that's something that I found helpful for students to relate back to whenever they come in for office hours or in lectures. I can always say, hey, remember in that game when you made that decision? And for them, they say, oh yeah, I do remember, because I tried in that game to win, and I knew exactly what I was doing, but I just couldn't win because of blank. And so they understand this a lot better. So that's all I have. Thank you so much.